Welcome to the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. I'm your host, Matt Bennett. Each episode we talk about the research and practical aspects of the trauma informed movement. This podcast is not designed to replace mental health services. If you feel uncomfortable or triggered by our discussion, please consider seeking your own trauma treatment. In no way is seeking treatment an admission of weakness. It is a chance to build resiliency and experience post-traumatic growth. You can find show notes, resources, and more at traumainformedlens.org. Welcome, friends, to the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. I am Matt. I'm here today with Megan and Kelly, who I am really excited to talk about trauma-informed schools. Listeners know I'm so passionate about this subject. I wrote a book on it, on trauma-sensitive early education with my much more brilliant first grade teacher wife, Sarah, on this. So, as our listeners know, I have a real passion for this topic because so much of other topics we talk about with homelessness, addiction, a lot of people, criminal justice system, whenever I work in those adult arenas, I know I'm looking at a lot of people who during their school years were labeled that bad kid and never really got the help they need. And then COVID happened. And if you know an educator, you know that their lives have been turned upside down over in every which way. So I am really excited to have this conversation. So Megan, let's start with you. Why don't you give us a quick introduction, and then we'll have Kelly introduce yourself and then dive into your work a little bit.
Great. Thanks for having us again, Matt. It's wonderful to be here with someone so passionate about trauma-informed care and education. So my name is Megan Marcus. I'm the founder of Fuel Ed. A little bit about me. My first professional aim was actually to be a therapist. So I was always really interested in people and delving into folks' inner worlds and kind of helping with human development. I thought that was, through the power of relationships. I was always drawn to that. But all of that changed when I had a really amazing opportunity to work with a professor on his book, Dr. Lou Cozolino, and the book was The Social Neuroscience of Education. So the journey of working on that book was essentially about taking this field of social neuroscience, or also known as interpersonal neurobiology, which shows the ways in which the brain is wired to connect throughout the lifespan and the ways in which we thrive in healthy, secure relationships. But we were really taking that field and those concepts and applying it to teaching and learning in schools. With this primary question of how are schools set up to thrive and succeed when relationships are central, or more often than not, really fail children when relationships are not placed at the center. Yeah. So I became intrigued by this idea of the ways in which educators could serve as these relational figures in children's lives, these secure attachment figures who could build secure relationships that are transformative to academic, social, and emotional outcomes, and even have the power to heal trauma. And that's really what sparked this idea for me to start this organization, which is all about developing the social and emotional competencies of educators so that they are equipped to build secure relationships that can change students' lives. And it was particularly eye-opening for me when I looked at teacher professional development and teacher education to see that despite the importance of relationships to an educator's everyday job and to student success and student outcomes, being in relationships is not something that's necessarily taught to educators. And what a shame, because there are fields such as counseling and psychotherapy where the professionals are taught how to build relationships, how to look at their own stuff in order to build healthier relationships. So why couldn't we just bridge the best practices and professional development from those fields to in the service of educators and their ability to best support students' learning and growth? So that's why I started Fuel Ed, and we've been around since 2012. Helping to grow the social emotional competencies of educators across the country.
Awesome. Kelly, you got to save me. Megan gave me about 5-6 different things I'm dying to dive into, but save me here. Please introduce yourself and a little about your passion and expertise as well.
Sure. Well, I'm Kelley Munger, and I kind of have the backward story of Megan, where I did start in the classroom and then became a therapist and really specialized working with families and young children, and a lot of especially children who were in the special education system. And I began to see that gap in my practice as a therapist between, wow, I'm with these kids for an hour a week, but I almost wish that I was their teacher. So I had 40 hours a week to build this relationship, to build these competencies, and to really serve in that secondary role of attachment figure. And so I went back and got a PhD. That was the logical solution, right, to seeing a gap in the system. And during my PhD program, I met Megan, and she introduced me to the world of Fuel Ed. And I like to say that it was love at first sight. And so when I graduated, I hopped right on board as a lead of research and development at Fuel Ed Schools. And I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for having us.
Awesome. Well, let me pick up with one of the shiny nuggets that you threw out in both of your introductions. Is, because to me, this really transcends education as well. Whether you're talking about a therapist, work with a lot of folks who their clients may be experiencing some of the most severe trauma, but a case manager is who the one that gets the trust, or the outreach worker. So I would love to start out, and please let's utilize the classroom and your work as examples here. But when you say that beautiful word of secondary attachment figures, I'd love to get a further definition of that. Well, what are we talking about there? And maybe just give a little bit of a refresher on what's an attachment figure, and then let's really jump into that secondary attachment figure role.
Sure. Okay. I will try not to go into the 7-page version of what the attachment figure is, or rather 700-page. But
don't discount the 7-page version. We got some time to stretch out here. Yeah.
Well, so at its core, an attachment figure is a safe haven, and meaning that the attachment figure is the person or persons where a child originally, right, can return for comfort, for care, for safety, for soothing. And through that cycle that we could call the attachment cycle, you think of it as a circle, right? Some people might be familiar with the circle of security. The child early on goes out, explores the world, grows, learns, maybe meets a challenge, and needs to come back to the safe haven in order to be calm, soothe, and sort of regain that confidence to go back out. Right. In an infant, this is simply, I'm crying, I need my diaper changed. An adult comes, provides that soothing and that care. The infant returns to calm. And so then the infant is learning, oh, I'm safe, I'm loved, I'm cared for. Yeah. And that's the attachment cycle. And the attachment figure serves that role of being a safe haven. Awesome. Right.
So secure base. I mean, we hear that word. As my audience knows, I'm a non-breeder, but I love to watch my friends, who some of them I've known for decades, become parents, and just that beautiful moment where, and what I know about young children is they're hungry or they poop themselves. That's about, I've always worked with the older youth. Professionally, it's like, so, baby starts to cry, and then, this person that, was partying with at age 25 is now this mature adult human being, which fascinates me as well. But just that, that almost non-communicative verbal smile that, hey, I'm okay and regulated. It's going to be okay. And then now, being old like I am now these little babies grow up to go off to college. Sometimes they come back home. This whole attachment cycle that we're seeing is just the beautiful step-by-step thing to watch. I don't have to do it at 2 a.m., which was one of our life choices with my wife and I, but I think it's beautiful when it happens in the afternoon and the baby actually stops crying.
And I think the interesting and amazing thing, Matt, is where, as a lot of folks understand that babies are born without these capabilities to regulate themselves. They absolutely need a parent or caregiver to literally keep them alive and help them perform these basic functions of being fed and staying warm and keeping them regulated. The truth of the matter is we actually rely on one another to help us regulate ourselves, not just when we're infants, but actually throughout the lifespan. And that's where we come in with this idea of secondary attachment figures. Educators play a very important role in helping students grow that part of the brain, their prefrontal cortex, that is not fully formed until much later in life, our early 20s, and can continue to be shaped throughout the lifespan. So when a student comes in dysregulated, maybe a student is showing signs of aggression, as you mentioned before, these labeled as bad kids, for educators to have the lens to understand it through attachment and what actually attachment needs are needing to be met in that moment, and how can they serve as a regulating force for that student? Because the more that they can help the student move from distress and dysregulation to calm and regulation, the brain is actually practicing doing that and building the neural networks to allow that child, soon to be an adult, to do it themselves. We, parents and caregivers and educators, can actually be this external brain. While there's a brain in the making, essentially.
Yes. So with my work, and I know a lot of your work, I would imagine as well, is with the school programs I help run and worked in, especially earlier on in my career, whether it was child welfare, juvenile justice, or special education, as we call it, duly diagnosed developmentally disabled, because we need another label to throw on children. Basically, behavioral and cognitive struggles. Talk to me about the importance of the educator. And I always am cautious with this, educators out there. We throw so much on you already that I love what Fuel Ed is doing is, hey, let's support our educators to build this skill set and not expect them also to be therapists and parents going into this. And I know that's not what you're talking about, but a lot of the youth that I know we're talking about, especially coming from maybe traumatic home lives, all of a sudden are coming in with, and we can define these as well, but for lack of a better word, maybe unhealthy attachment style. So I'm not saying they don't have a primary attachment figure, because for better or worse, we're going to have that. So when you're helping educators, and I think this is great for our audience, understand that, that your role is in some ways really almost outsized with these youth coming in without that healthy, secure base established in childhood. And where do you even start with that for educators who also have to get good test scores, manage 30 kids in a classroom, so on and so forth?
Yeah, it's a lot. Well,
I told you we'd get deep.
It's a really good question, actually, and I will start with a little story, because I too am married to an educator, and when we actually made a cross-country move right before the pandemic, and he was obviously changing teaching jobs, and he had taught a few young men in his robotics program for several years in a row, and they had really developed an attachment in the true sense of that word with him. His classroom was their safe haven. They came at every break, and they weren't there they were just there to be safe and to hang out. And they this group of guys, on the last day that my husband was at the school, my husband's a bike commuter, and they all brought their bikes to school, and they rode him halfway home and sort of sent him out. And it was just this beautiful, beautiful reflection of how they wanted to honor the safe haven. They wanted to emulate, to match him, and to sort of follow him a little bit like not to be demeaning at all to these boys, but a duckling's following the duck, right? There was an imprint, and they wanted to ride their bikes behind him. And so I tell that story because I think it's just important to say out loud for educators, wow, you do carry this huge what can be a burden, but can also be an honor and a joy, the role that you play. And the question isn't if an educator wants to be or is ready to be an attachment figure, you just are. The question is, are you wanting to be a more secure attachment figure or a more insecure attachment figure? And knowing that that's just reality that we can name. I think that's powerful. I think it's honoring to the work that educators are already doing. And so when we think about where do we start, and there's already so much on educators' plates, that really is at the heart of our work, is empathy for educators.
Yeah.
And so our goal in the work that we do, really in everything that we put out in the world, we want an educator to walk away feeling really safe and really seen, which is the opposite of sort of what a lot of educators tell us that they feel inside of their school cultures, inside of our culture in general, just in an attitude toward teachers. And so I would say, really through the lens of my husband and talking about education day after day, kind of from the on the ground lens, I would say that when he gets the sense that his students feel safe and seen, he feels empowered as an educator, and the job actually lightens. And so there's a bit of a paradox there, that as he begins to, as he continues, I would say, to grow as a secure educator, which of course I think he is, and I see that and indicated in how his students respond to him, that the more secure he becomes and the more he's able to really name and own that role, even the things like academics and testing and sort of the things that pile up on an educator's plate are not so weighty, because he knows why he's there. And also because his students trust him, they are learning. They are excelling, they are achieving. And that's not something that is necessarily a pressure on him. It's something that he delights in doing. And so that's how do you have anything to add there, Megan? It was a really big question. So
yeah, great answer. So, and what I love and what I try to really communicate to educators as well, because then coming in and saying, because I think the message and how you deliver it is so important, because, you remember all these kids that historically, because of behavioralism, we thought were weighing the rewards in the treasure box versus going to yellow light before they behaved. No, these kids, a lot of them were being harmed outside the school. I mean, just psychologically to hold that with this shift, I think is a very, like I said, if you want to test yourself as a trainer, don't go fill a stadium and talk about motivation and yell at people, but talk about trauma with folks that are struggling with this at this level, because it's such a powerful thing, and we've got to figure how to communicate this, that, and as my audience knows, I hate the terminology of bad kids, but I think most educators will understand that this label often gets placed very early on. Sometimes if you've got the, many kids in a family, before you walk through the door, they're dreading you because of your last name. And this real paradigm shift. And Megan, maybe I can ask you, how do you hold and create a safe space for educators to kind of experience, maybe cognitive dissonance may not be the perfect word, but you almost have to reflect on the philosophy that was drilled in as, boy, if we just get the right point system or light system in place, everything will turn out wonderful.
Yeah, you're so right, Matt. There's a lot of unlearning, and it can feel a little uncomfortable because so much of our educational system, our entire educational system was built on behavioralism.
Yes.
So I guess I'll walk you through a little bit of the pillars of what we expose educators to and the shifts we see it creating. So one of the things we do is we expose them. The kind of the whole arc is science, skills, self-awareness. So the science of trauma, the science of attachment, when you learn this, you can't look away.
Yeah.
It's everywhere. You can't unsee what you've learned about the way that early trauma impacts the brain and the amazing new science about how relationships heal.
Yeah.
And so I think that just that schema alone, if all educators really had that foundational knowledge, that would shift a lot.
Yeah.
The second thing we do is skills. Okay, now that you're motivated and you know that the behaviors you're seeing in the classroom are just the tip of the iceberg and a reflection of attachment style, a reflection of trauma, reflection of potential harm, and really survival strategies built to adapt. And that you have power. You have immense power to heal and to promote learning. Then the question is like, well, what can I do? Educators very quickly want to shift into action, problem solving mode. Give me the handbook. I'll implement it right away. So
yes, as my every page we wrote in this freaking book. Hopefully she doesn't listen. She'll listen to this episode, I know, but it's like, well, how do we implement this right away? I'm like, well, I got to get at least through the amygdala first. Let me get through the great point.
Educators are so special in that way. I never know there's any other personality type that is just so hungry for solutions and application and like ready to go. So we give them skills. How they want to be now. They want to be a secure attachment figure. How do I be a secure attachment figure? And so some foundational skills are really in our communication style. How, when a student comes to you distressed, can you shift your instincts from problem solving to empathy, to being simply, quote unquote, simply, because it's much more difficult than it sounds, be a holding space, allow for those emotions to live and be accepted. How can you mirror a child's feelings and say, this is really hard for you. You feel so lonely and disconnected from your friends. Period. End of sentence. And just stop and pause there to allow the child or student to express what they're expressing and feel that sense of being seen and trust. So that's one kind of core skill that's so foundational to becoming a secure attachment figure. And another one is knowing and sharing yourself. We call it genuineness. Because relationships are reciprocal. And I think there's some unlearning there, because teachers are taught don't smile till Christmas and be tough and you have to be this authority figure. And we're definitely not saying be a pushover and have no boundaries. Boundaries are really also a very important part of secure attachment. But how can you know what you're feeling when you're irritated, when you're triggered, and be able to express it genuinely to students? So those are two core skills that we build. And then the last, but certainly not least, in fact, the most foundational work that an educator can do is in self-awareness. Because it's cool to learn about trauma, and it's cool to even start imparting and practicing some skills related to secure communication. But you actually won't be able to grow as a secure attachment figure until you've unpacked your own trauma. And done so in a relationship where you feel safe and secure. So that's the absolute pinnacle of what we do and encourage educators to do, to get your own counseling and psychotherapy and find secure relationships where you can make sense of your own story.
Oh, wow. I'm going to delay gratification a little bit, put my prefrontal cortex on, because I want to dive into school culture and the importance of supporting. We're going to get there, but I'd love to get your opinion on a little nugget of research that, I came across in an attachment book that just always resonate me. And again, my experience a little different, because a lot when you work with kids in residential or who are in alternative school settings because they're too violent or whatever for public schools, you sort of get the crash course on this. But one of the things I wish somebody would have told me in graduate school, one of those things I paid a lot of money and didn't get. One was that trauma was the root of a lot of these issues you were going to be dealing with. But the other thing that I found so fascinating, just made sense, is that children, and this can go on to adulthood, but children grow up in this attachment style. And what I knew about attachment, it becomes the template for other relationships in your life. The thing I wish somebody would have said out loud to me at the time, and in hindsight, it was obvious, is if this is their template for a relationship, they can feel, and suspend your own maybe upbringing if you were raised with a secure base, they almost feel safer in what we might consider a dysfunctional sort of relationship. And they can become little experts at getting you to fall into their template. And then I think about educators is you've got a class of 20, 30 people, and you don't have necessarily the time I have as a therapist to sit back and think about the countertransference and transference that are going. As therapists, we get a lot of time to sit back and contemplate the nature of humanity and how it's playing out in that session. My wife has got to deal with that attachment style while co-regulating 22 others, first graders. So I'd love to get any thoughts, because it was a fascinating little nugget of information that said, that's why I struggle. Because again, I think with trauma is, relationships, a little bit easier sell than this kid is driving me freaking nuts, and one educator I thought was really good. I was doing work on a military base with the school district, and she's like, well, I've got 3 of these in my class, and I've got it's a full-time job to keep one of them not throwing a chair through the window. So I wonder, with this complexity, I just love to get your thoughts on that and how that manifests in the classroom, and any insight that you give for almost what I think we set up environments for failure in some ways when you have the ratios we have in our modern educational system.
Yeah. Oh, there's a lot I could say. Well, first of all, empathy for teachers
Yes.
who are listening. It is so difficult that we don't make accommodations in our ratios for histories of trauma.
Yeah.
One summer I was a counselor at a trauma-informed camp for kids just to have a week of fun. And do you know how we got through that week? Through a one-on-one ratio.
Yeah.
Every camper had a counselor, and our parents were just so thrilled that they could actually leave their kid at camp for a week, because otherwise it wouldn't have worked. And so starting with that place of empathy, and I think 2 things really jump out here. One is, I do think it's a huge paradigm shift for a lot of educators to realize that children in their survival attempts are generating the relationship patterns of the classroom often, rather than the other way around. It seems straightforward, but a lot of educators that I speak with will say, oh my goodness, you're right. Little Johnny pulls out my dismissiveness or my reactivity. In my other relationships, I'm able to stay in secure behavior. And so what's going on here, right? And the idea I think that's really important is, if we want to dive in really quickly to a little bit of science around the window of tolerance.
You can always dive into some science on the window of tolerance.
Everyone knows I keep this around.
I love it.
For those of you listening, just my little engine running plate to find out the zone of regulation I'm experiencing. But what we see in a classroom is that if you have a group of children, let's say 15 children who are in the red zone or who are running hot and high, and in that situation, a teacher is being exposed to a lot of stress behaviors. And so paradoxically, that teacher needs an even larger window of tolerance, an even larger green zone. But we have nothing in place to actually provide that for a teacher. And so, like you said, that's a setup for failure. Mm-hmm. On top of that, if a teacher, and this is really where our work comes in, I think, if a teacher has triggers around certain early experiences where they were not seen, where they were not safe, where they were not soothed, then you have another layer of essentially a student's behavior triggering the insecure attachment history of an educator, which of course creates survival attempts in the teacher. That might look like shutting down, withdrawing, leaving emotionally or cognitively, leaving the room, or maybe literally leaving the room. Or that might look like reactivity and irritability, even yelling. And those are moments that create burnout, that create shame, that create pain, and that only reinforce, right, the trauma histories of not just the student, but also the educator.
Yeah.
And so there's this huge gap here, because if we're asking educators to have wide enough green zones to be in a classroom with 19 trauma histories, he or she needs a lot of support for that. And that's really the gap that we are passionate about filling.
Awesome. Megan, I can't delay gratification much longer to dive into that. Anything you want to add before I move us to school cultures? Because I've held off now for about 30 minutes.
It's an awesome segue. I think Kelly said it so well. I think just the headline there is, when we talk about this lofty goal of educators being secure attachment figures, it makes it sound so like rosy and like, okay, jump in and here's what a secure attachment figure is and here's what it is and you just unpack your history and there's the handbook for how to do it. But it is, the bottom line is that teachers and students both have attachment histories and they create a dance.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what Kelly was speaking to. So we can't just help educators learn about attachment styles because students have attachment styles. Well, teachers also have attachment styles that get essentially activated. Yeah. So I love the way that you shared all that, Kelly. And I think the teachers having a lot of space to get regulated again is a perfect segue for school culture.
Yeah. And I would just like to, as we transition into this, is one of the questions I get asked a lot, and I kind of introed it, is I've got 3 of these kids. I got 5 of these kids. And how do I regulate them all while making sure I deliver the academic level that I'm paid to deliver? And, the hard answer to that is, I don't know if that's possible. I think we can give you a lot of pay attention, transitions, mindfulness, movement. I mean, there's strategies. I'm not going to leave you without, 5 things you can go implement, because if I don't give a teacher 5 things they can go implement, I'm never going to be asked back to do a follow-up training. So there's things you can do, but one of the things that I hope, is with this movement around trauma-informed, trauma-sensitive, whatever you want to throw the definition to be is, for me, one of my drivers of passion, one is because I've spent time in school programs, but 2, we can invest in, and I hate the term paraprofessional, because if you've ever worked in a classroom, teacher assistant is a word I like to use, but though worth your weight in gold. What they allow the teacher to do, what they do for that. Now you have 2 secondary attachment figures in the classroom. When I ran the special education school, you were talking about your camp, we had 75 staff for 100 kids. Now we were working with a population that was very challenging and also incredibly rewarding, but it allowed us to create the safety we needed to build those relationships. So one is my whole advocacy around trauma sensitive schools is, hey, let's invest in mental health services, support in the classroom, so we don't have to build another shelter or freaking jail. If we could get these services up front, and sometimes I think we get in our silos where we don't see what's the consequences of setting teachers, again, maybe not up to fail, because some of them do amazing jobs, but we almost require a astounding human being to walk into a classroom every day.
Yeah.
To do this work. And I'm not that astounding human being. I think I've got my strengths, but it's what my wife does every day, I have no freaking clue how she does it. She comes home and goes to sleep at 4:30, so I get a half hour with her to ask her about her day, and then she passes out on the couch, So that's just, I think something really key. And then the second level of this, which I've been dying to dive into with you, is if I were to have to create a failed system on supporting your workforce, it is modern education. Here's what I see, and I want to maybe give a little longer intro into this and let you run with it, and because I'm really want to hear your scenario. Is in most schools I work with, teachers get, and I'm going to use air quotes here, which I'm not a big fan of, an hour or 2 of supervision a year, which means the principal walks in the classroom for an hour or so, which is the most stressful day of any teacher's year, most stressful couple hours. they observe for an hour or two and then give feedback in some way, shape, or form about the teacher's performance. That to me is just, from a leadership perspective, stupid. I mean, ridiculous and dumb. We've created a whole system around that model of professional development. But what I really see from a trauma-informed perspective is, show me a school that doesn't have a huge trauma happen somewhere throughout the school year. A parent passes away from cancer. Maybe a student passes away. There's a domestic violence situation. An angry parent threatens staff. I mean, there's usually dozens of these throughout the school year in the typical school. What I see, using the language you've given us and the information you've given us, is, as adults, we may not call them attachment figures, but we co-regulate with other people as well. And what I see in modern education, one is, in a unionized environment, often there's not an us. There's administration and there's the teacher / other professionals in the school. But because there's no structured social support, I like to call this structured supervision from our mental health ideas. I would never encourage a mental health professional to go into this without probably an hour of supervision every week or every 2 weeks. Teachers get none of that for the most part. And so then the trauma happens and there's no psychological safety. There's very little trust, unless the principal is this astonishing, also human being who can come in and do this. And I always say, if you create systems around astonishing human beings, you're saying you're doing yourself a disservice. So I'd love to get your feedback on teacher support, teacher self-care. Yes, yes, yes. And I think I'm pretty safe looking statistically. Instead of doing that, we are collectively on this mission to try to create trauma-sensitive schools within structures that are designed to destroy the workforce. So I want to shut up. I'm loving. I want to hear your thoughts on, how do we keep our educators maybe even just sane, but healthy, and how do you approach the school culture and environment from your trauma-informed lens?
Great. So good. So I'll say a little bit. I'd love to actually hear Kelly's thoughts on this as well. We had a bit of a journey on that same line of thought as well. Like, when I first started the organization, I was like, we just need to bridge these skills and professional development experiences that therapists have, make them applicable to teachers, and we're golden.
Voila.
And there's a lot of progress you can make with that alone. Absolutely. I tell you, it's pretty powerful stuff.
Yeah.
But there's a limit, because then there's a school building with schedules, policies, and practices, and it becomes a misfit, essentially. We even saw, at sometimes, educators kind of saw the light, became so aware, decided they wanted to become relationship-driven educators, but they weren't in relationship-driven schools. And that actually led them to more dissonance and to want to sometimes flee the profession, but oftentimes just ideally find other schools that are more aligned.
Yeah.
But that's a shame. And we want to take the work farther, because schools do need to be reimagined to be relationship driven if we want any of this to work. So another thing in our journey at Fuel Ed that we sort of discovered, we were simply trying to basically improve our organization's culture and on our own journey with that, and found something, a schema called deliberately developmental organizations, which is a wonderful, I don't even know what to call it, schema or construct that is basically says that in the workplace, since you were sort of talking about leadership and the workplace, most of us are lying, hiding, and faking, right? We're trying to cover our butts and not really show our true selves. And what a myth that is, because really, the greatest human potential and human motivation comes from this desire to grow. And if you instead make your company culture or your school culture, which is the way I'm going with this, a place where growth is not just, a little bit something on the side that happens maybe 2 hours a year, as you were sort of pointing to, but central. This idea that you are deliberately developing the employees there, not just professionally, but personally through the everyday structures of the workplace. And that's when we realized that's exactly what needs to happen to make our mission not a fringe or niche thing, but actually a paradigm shift whereby social emotional development and growth of educators isn't an add-on, but foundational to teacher professional development, school cultures, and just what it means to be a teacher. So what that looks like is really reinventing and reimagining a lot of policies and practices in schools to orient around safe spaces and for relationships for educators, reimagining the role of the principal, assistant principal, mentor teachers, anyone who's in a secure or insecure attachment relationship with a teacher. Who's that teacher's teacher? Who's that teacher's mentor? Who's that teacher's attachment figure? Them really reimagining their role as helping that teacher get those spaces for regulation. And so a quick story about this, we had a leadership team go through our training a few years ago. And we just got an update on their work. Essentially what they did, in addition to kind of their own personal and interpersonal growth, is they got together as a team and said, how can we start applying this to our setting? Because they were in a turnaround type of setting where they were tasked with some really, really tough conditions and some tough numbers, and it was their job to make change. And so they said, let's start by creating check-ins for the leadership team. Pretty simple, the leadership team, the principal will provide empathic listening for an hour a week with the leadership team. And the leadership team will then provide empathic listening for an hour a week to all the teachers.
Awesome.
It sounds really simple, really basic, but it completely transformed the school. I'll just call out some of these numbers. By the end of this, well, not end of this process since it's ongoing, but where they are now is they saw a 67% reduction in out of school placement.
Wow.
They took their staff retention from 57% to 90% yearly. And they had a 21% in test scores. Yeah. Essentially, from this very simple practice of helping educators feel safe and seen, the school culture transformed completely. Wow. Because the educators received that kind of care, they were then able to start providing more of that care and that deep listening to students, and everything shifted. So just a small story about how the culture has to be a secure culture, because you can't rely on these heroic efforts by individual teachers alone.
Right. Well, I mean, it's such a great, Kelly, I want to get your thinking on this too, but the thing that, education is like, if you have some strategy and you go in and like you create amazing, it's just like this astounding laboratory where if you do a pretty decent job at some of the basics of human psychology, all of a sudden you can create this high performing environment, and hey, NPR will run story after story on you. Like, it's like, because you have those test scores. One of the things I found really interesting in the book writing process and really changed my mind is I thought, coming out of, and being I wasn't a principal because you obviously have to have education, but I was running a school. So having been in that role and being incredibly relational myself as a therapist, like supervision with my teachers was part of this amount of time each week is set aside because that's the priority, that support. My whole assumption going into the leadership chapters of the book and being able to step, because I wanted to position my wife and write it through her voice for the most part as the person in the classroom is, well, we need more maybe vice principal, assistant principal capacity to provide the support. And she says, it won't work. And I'm like, well, why not? It's like, we don't trust our administration. And I'm like, well, that's just you. And so I then, because I've got educators all in orbits of my life, I reached out to about a dozen folks and saying, hey, just tell me I'm right, because I think my wife is off here. And they're like, oh, no, we would never discuss anything personal, any challenges with our principal, or because they evaluate us. And I so even like as someone who's been in education, ran a school, like I had no idea about the foundational level of mistrust that exists. So let's give a lot of credit to the district that you're talking about, the schools you're talking about, for overcoming that, because that wasn't probably just an integration of a new practice, that was overcoming a lot of, as I like to say with my trauma-informed care trainings, we're often working with a level of mistrust to overcome before we start to build the trust. And says a lot, I would say, about your work with them, and they're taking that seriously. Well, Kelley, jump in here.
Yeah, I think part of the reason they were able to make that change is also the paradigm shift of secure attachment figures provide unconditional positive regard to the folks that they're caring for. And I think that we have some really hard questions to ask inside the education system of why is it that educators for the most part would assume a more punitive, not at all an unconditional positive regard from their leaders, from their admin. And that is a really large conversation, but at the end of the day, you cannot provide secure attachment if you don't believe in the person that you're caring for. And even in our internal culture at Fuel Ed, which has been a very, very, very powerful force in my life personally. I work on a team where I know that everyone there believes in my ability to grow and change and develop. Everyone there holds me in positive regard and wants good things for me. And also, I think this is important. Everyone at Fuel Ed in our internal partner team knows my story. They know my attachment story. They know my attachment history. They know my shame triggers. Everyone at Fuel Ed knows that I am scared of coming across as incompetent. And how does that change our meetings together? How does that change their perception of me? It means that when I come across as cool and distant, or like I'm a so-called expert, that they know there's a tenderness toward my defensiveness or my defense mechanisms. And I think that we are a bit of a proof of concept. This is possible. That this is possible. And really, truly foundational to that is, one, the skill of empathy, and two, the self-awareness about our stories and that shared self-awareness. And those two foundational pieces inside of a school culture, if facilitated well, if structured well, if held well, especially by the leadership, I mean, I don't even think we know how high the sky is when it comes to
well, just like your test scores, and you hear these, like I said, I'm a big NPR listener, so you like hear that somebody went into urban Oakland and all of a sudden created the best performing district in the state of California. Like it's not. And this is where, like, I just wonder about principal education. I don't know if it's sort of the union, them versus us mentality that it's like, I don't know if I fully comprehend the history of the problem, so to speak, but it's just like, boy, if you can do some of these fundamental things, and I'm not saying these turnaround principals, leaderships, educators aren't amazing folks. I think anybody who dedicates themselves into this realm is an amazing human being to begin with, and hopefully we don't totally burn them out and they lose that altogether. But it's like, boy, we can measure this with test scores. So schools give us this great laboratory for the example that you gave us to say, hey, if principals, you can be a caring human being, and it's okay. In fact, it'll actually improve the very metrics that you get measured on. And that's like why that's so hard in education, just kind of like, I mean, it's fun because we're working on a paradigm shift, but it's also like how do we get this bad? Like, which just astounds me too.
I think there's something about the pressure and the ripple effect, because like I said, we did start with this idea of teacher, student. And then we realized, well, the principal is this attachment figure to the teachers. They have to grow their social emotional competencies. So let's work with principals. But then you work with principals and it's like, well, they have a manager at the district level, and the pressure comes down, all the way from the top, and the modeling for whether relationships are conditional or unconditional starts from the very top. The rewards and punishment, the behavioral nature of the relationships and the relationship management is it trickles. in the same way that trauma trickles like intergenerationally. It's like this is the layers and through the hierarchy of the school system.
Absolutely. So I want to ask a final big question out there, and I'm sure my listeners like, well, we've got to invite them back, Matt, very quickly. So obviously, this has been a great conversation. I can't believe we've almost hit the hour mark already. But you know, one of the things I do a lot of self-care training as well as leadership and trauma-informed pieces. And one of the things I've not used this metaphor, but I've started using it to in a different way, is there's this self-care sort of typical thing of an analogy of, you know, when you're on the plane and they say, put your mask on before you help someone else put their mask on. And I get like, hey, take care of yourself before you take care of your others. And yes, that is a message we need to scream at the top of our lungs to pretty much everybody in our society right now. However, you know, one of the latest surveys I've seen, teachers number 4 on the list for burnout after physicians, nurses, and social service workers, principals, especially elementary principals, number 5. So I'm using the analogy for the first time to say, okay, the masks have dropping down, but the plane is crashing. We've got to fix the freaking plane. Like if we're having to keep putting oxygen masks on, that means something is going wrong. And so like as we've had this huge, and I'm really encouraging, think about the pandemic. And I don't think I have to convince educators on this much at all, just watching what I have a first grade classroom in my bedroom at this point. You know, what they've gone through is, I use the word chronic trauma. Some people use small t to describe that if we're under a tremendous load of stress for an extended period of time, maybe a family living under extreme poverty where there may not be a traumatic event that happens, but it's just this level of stress creates a very similar neurobiological response. I'd love you to show me a teacher who hasn't experienced chronic trauma in the last year, you know, and you would be able to probably pick somebody out, but I would say good luck finding them right off the bat. So I think we all agree the plane is broken. What would you like to see coming out of this? Again, I feel comfortable using the words because I keep trauma, you know, don't use it unless it's a trauma, but I would say these traumatic times, what opportunities do you see for us as advocates for trauma sensitive, trauma informed schools? How can we start to fix the damn plane?
Fix the damn plane. Oh, wow. You know, I mean, I think that again, I also live in a physics classroom here. And I can say that, you know, watching my husband after 20 years of teaching, this has been the hardest year of teaching so far in 20 years. And there's a lot of sorrow and loss this year that I just want to name and notice with teachers who are feeling that, this sense of loss of identity, loss of relationships with students, loss of the ability to do a lot of things that make you feel really purposeful and alive in your vocation and career. And so I just want to name that. And I also want to name and really highlight this idea of the oxygen mask. Meg and I cringe a little bit when we hear that, because obviously we understand the intent of that. Yeah. But I think it can feel dismissive to some educators. Hey, go and take a bubble bath.
Yeah. I think we might give the exact same training. I use the bubble bath analogy. Yeah.
Really? Oh my goodness.
It's like bubble bath on a Wednesday is a good thing. It's not your self-care plan. It is my line. So yeah.
I'm gonna cut it. And so, I mean, I think inside, when we think about the burning plane, I think that the term self-care is a bit of a misnomer. I think it's just care. And I think that actually, from the work that we've done with educators, from the research we've done with educators, it's less about, I need to be able to take that bubble bath every day, and more about, I need my everyday work environment to be a place that I can be safe and soothed inside of, that I'm not having trauma and chronic trauma activated all day long, that my nervous system isn't literally revving in the red zone of excitatory neurochemistry, so much that I need to crash when I get home, right? That's going to have a toxic effect on the body. And so the big question of fixing the plane is, again, back to our earlier conversation about how do we create systems and cultures of care, of unconditional positive regard and empathy. And in places where being an educator, including being an educational leader, especially being an educational leader, that part of the requirement is that you are engaged in self-awareness and self-reflective practice.
Beautifully stated.
Right. And so if I were going to fix the plane, I think we might start with psychotherapy.
Yeah.
And for providing that space, I think that if teachers knew that they were safe and seen every day at work, that would take the edge off of the chronic trauma that's happening.
Yeah. And I think it sounds so powerful what you say is the psychotherapy piece. Like, and I think anybody who has a public voice at this point has got to say, hey, I'm getting my own therapy. Like, and it's great to see the youth of today are like, oh yeah, we're all going to go to therapy like next week. Like, it's like, but like folks for me from the Midwest, I'm just yelling back home to say, we've got it. Like I said, for leaders now, it's like, I'm not kind anymore. It's like, you better have an employee assistance program and you better know how to use it. And you should be thinking about how do you get the EAP professionals to your school so nobody has to drive or take time off. I mean, I'm really encouraging folks right now, and I think this opens up an opportunity. What's your recovery plan? And if you've ever done a strategic plan or improvement plan or whatever language you use, this better take precedence over everything else because trauma, the psychological impact of trauma and performance and everything else doesn't stop just because the pandemic goes away. We're carrying all that into the future, and you better have a plan because we're going to see, things drop. And I'm just afraid people dropping dead. And that's not a joke. That's not to be cute. That's not to get you to hire me for a self-care training. That's because I've studied this for 2 decades now, and we weren't healthy before. This level of stress, we weren't ready. And I'm talking about my friends in healthcare, social services, and the criminal justice system as well. All these folks who dominate this, we weren't prepared for this psychologically. And yeah, the plane was crashing, and then somebody shot a missile at it, and here we are.
Matt, there's a lot of now with, hopefully the vaccine showing, rolling out and people gearing up, hopefully for normalcy to start returning. People are thinking about learning loss, but I think it's really we're looking at the wrong target. It's safety lost.
Yes.
There's been so much safety lost, and we can't think or do anything about the learning loss until we address the safety and the recuperation that needs to happen for students, families, and educators.
Boom. Drop the mic, Megan. Okay. I'm not going to add anything to that because I think that's a great way to go out. I just want to say this has been a great conversation. We're going to post some information in the show notes at traumainformedlens.org. But before we leave, I'm sure I've got folks interested in reaching out, learning more. Just maybe your name is actually really cool, by the way. I'm looking at your website now. So congratulations on that. But give folks where can they find out a little bit more about you? And again, look in the show notes for more detail on that.
Great. Yeah. So you can find us at www.fueledschools, like fueledschools.org.
Very good.
We'll have all of our programs listed there, free webinars, a great blog, and we actually have resources to help educators find a counselor that will help provide that secure attachment, because not all styles of counseling have that same philosophy. So we sort of have a little bit of a guide about how to find a counselor that will help provide that security of attachment for you if you're an educator.
And we're also on social media, so at Fueled Schools on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook.
Awesome. Instagram. I need to get on Instagram a little bit more. So maybe this is my excuse. Maybe you can teach me how to be on Instagram and stay socially healthy. So I want to thank you both. Like I said, I'm sure my listeners about 15 minutes in to say, oh, we got to have them back. So open invitation. I feel like we could explore so much more on the topics that we briefly covered today. So thank you so much for the amazing work you do. I think anybody working to advocate for trauma-informed, trauma-sensitive schools, we need to get the school boards, we need to get policymakers, we need to have educators learn that, just because there's this barrier doesn't mean we can't yell over to the other side and voice what we know with this knowledge. So it's just so great to meet folks like you out there doing this work as well. And thanks for everything that you do too.
Thank you.
Thanks,
so much.
everybody.
For having us.